Welcome to Storytelling with Data, the podcast where listeners around the world learn to be better storytellers and presenters with best-selling author, speaker, and workshop guru Cole Nussbaumer-Knaflic. We'll cover a wide range of topics that will help you effectively show and tell your data stories. So get ready to separate yourself from the mess of 3D exploding pie charts and deliver knockout presentations. And with that, here's Cole.
Hello, welcome, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Cole, and I am excited to be here today chatting with Shirley Wu and Nadieh Bremer. Ladies, welcome to the Storytelling with Data podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Shirley and Nadieh are award-winning data visualization freelancers, but I actually feel like when I say those words that it's far too restrictive. They each work at this really fun and fascinating space where data meets art. And they create visualizations of information that are really an experience. And they've worked with clients like Google News Lab, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the New York Times, Scientific American, The Guardian, and many more. And together, they have co-authored a beautiful new book, Data Sketches, that was officially published earlier this week. So the first thing I have to do is officially congratulate you both. You built a book.
Yay! Thank you. We've joined the Published Authors Club with you.
Well, welcome to the club. But it's funny, right? Because you spend all this time and energy for such a long amount of time. And then that period gets over, but there's still this big gap between that ending and the physical book existing, right? Which feels really weird. So I know it must feel amazing to have it in your hands and be able to share it with others.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're going to talk a lot more about Data Sketches, both the multi-year project that you undertook, as well as the book that grew out of it. And just real quick, for those who are tuning in live, you'll have the opportunity to ask your questions and steer our conversation. You can do that at any point through the chat window. I'll be following along there and incorporating those into our conversation. First, though, I'd love to help those who are watching and listening who may not be familiar with you and your work get to know you a little better. So I actually thought it would be fun to start with your meet cute. So I don't know if you know this phrase, but meet cute is usually used in the film industry, and it's the charming encounter between two characters. So I think usually it's meant to be a romantic relationship, but I think you can have a meet cute for productive, creative relationships as well. So I'd love for you to tell us about how you met each other, and maybe through that incorporate a bit about your respective backgrounds.
So it was 2016, somewhere in the spring, and there was this data visualization conference happening in Boston called OpenVis, and we were both there because we both were honored to be speakers there, and we had sort of kind of met on the web in a Slack channel, but we hadn't really had like a conversation yet. It was more of this group. And there were people there, and several of the people from that Slack group, they were also going to OpenVis. And so it was sort of posted in that Slack groups like, hey, shall we meet the day before to have some lunch, and finally get to meet each other in real life. So I show up at that bar, and Shirley's there too, and maybe Shirley takes over from here.
So this is, I guess, the meet cute moment, which is, so that Slack group was actually started in the Bay Area with a lot of the data viz practitioners in the Bay Area. So I think I knew almost everybody in that group except for Nadieh. So I think most people in that group knew each other except Nadieh, because she lives in Amsterdam, we were all meeting her in person the first time around. And it was a bookstore because we were having brunch, not a bar yet. Not a bar yet.
Oh, right. Yes, you're right.
But I remember walking into the bookstore and then finding Nadieh and being like, so what you cannot tell from online is that Nadieh is extremely tall, like 6 foot something. And so I remember just being like, hello, Nadieh. And that was like I think one of the strongest impressions I've had meeting someone in real life. And yeah, and then it was really easy to get along with Nadi. And then we like kind of spent that group of friends. We like spent the conference like hanging out with each other. Yeah.
Yeah,
All
good
right.
time.
So you've met, you're at a conference, you had some things in common beforehand because you were a part of the same Slack channel. How does that grow into a project? And what were you each doing at that point in time, work wise?
So I was, let's see, I'm a graduated astronomer, and then I started working at a consultancy agency as a data scientist. But after 4 years, I kind of switched to wanting to do more data visualization. And when OpenVis happened, or right after that, I was working for a different company as a D3 data visualization dashboard creator. And when we got back home, we started, we remained sort of in contact, but it wasn't until a few weeks later when Shirley started digging into several tutorials that I'd written about the different examples that I'd shown in my talk during OpenVis that we really started chatting. And that was also coincidentally the time when the Information is Beautiful Awards, when you could send in new things again. And we were just chatting about, hey, do you have anything to
Nope,
send in?
nothing.
And and I was
Happens.
basically the same. And we kind of were sad about that. Like, wait, in the last year, have we not found the time to create like some bigger personal projects that we want to send in? And that was the point when Shirley had this brilliant idea.
That was the catalyst because I had just finished about 2.5 years at a startup where it was kind of like one of those, nights and weekends kind of things. And that's why I didn't have the time to work on any projects. And I had just quit to try my hand at freelancing. And that's when I was like, oh, Naughty, I have this idea, this kind of crazy idea. Do you want to collaborate on something with me? And I actually don't ask this very often because I've been a little bit burned from past collaborations of if you're working on something that's like more a personal or side project, that obviously always takes kind of like a second priority to your day job, right? But I think seeing how prolific Nadi was in her side projects and her tutorials, I was like, oh, maybe this is someone that like I can really do this with. And what I did not know was because I've always been scared of the other person not being motivated to finish. What I did not know was how much more motivated Nadi was to finish everything, and this is why we were able to finish the project and the book.
Yeah, one of the first sort of one of these tests that you have to do when you go to these in-house courses for businesses. So after, like, when I was just done with astronomy, I went to one of them, and the first test that I did told me, you are a finisher. You want to finish whatever you start. It doesn't matter how you want to ship it somehow.
So that's the perfect personality to team up with, right? If you're wanting to make progress on something. Okay.
Yeah.
So you get connected. Did you have the idea for what Data Sketches was going to be when you started off, or you just said, hey, let's visualize some things together? Or
Ooh, yeah. I think that it was funny because then Nadi was also so excited about the idea, and we like really started talking really quickly about it. And I think we actually got the like idea settled in less than a day. I think we were like, oh, we should, have. I think from the very beginning we were like, we should have like 12 different topics. I don't know why we thought that. Um, we were like, for each topic, let's have a phase of data gathering, and let's also have a phase of. So Nadi had the great idea of having the sketch phase because as my background is in software engineering, and I have this weird thing where like I'm just like I do not need to write anything down. Everything is in my head, and it's gonna get coded out that way. That was like my weird younger self. But Nadi was like, no, the sketch part is really important. So then we had the sketch phase, and then finally we had the code phase, and then I think even the like part about let's do a write up was a pretty like last minute like, hey, like maybe some way to differentiate this project. Was like we kind of just like last minute slapped that idea on, and all of that happened probably in a few hours, and then we took like another week trying to come up with the name.
and so you knew at this point that it's something you were going to put online, or did that decision happen later?
No, it was definitely online always because everything that we create is always web-based and online. And although it wasn't our intention to make it into something big, we definitely wanted it to share it, but more with our friends. Get some feedback on it, have fun, have a build up your portfolio a little bit
Yeah.
along the way.
Yep.
But mostly to have fun, and then it turned into something a little bigger, and then it turned into a book.
Okay, so at this point, so you've decided it's going to be online. You've set out some different phases, right? Shirley, you mentioned the sketch phase and the code phase, and then you decided you're going to do the write-ups. And so where does it go from here?
So we decided that we'd first do two topics, just keeping it all sort of secret, just to see how it would go, to see how the collaboration would go, and the ideas that we had. So we started, like I think this was the end of June, and we thought, well, we'll start July 1st, and we had a topic movies, and then we basically went with that. We created. We thought of our ideas that we wanted to do. I settled on the Lord of the Rings, and Shirley wanted to do something with the blockbusters for every year that she was been alive.
Should we show those? Because those are actually some of our smallest, most bite-sized projects we've done for data sketches.
All right. So for those listening, I'm pulling up the datasketch.es, the book website, where if you start scrolling, you can start to see some of the beautiful things. Shirley or Nadieh, stop me when I get there. I think this one.
Yeah, it's all the way at the bottom.
All the way down because it was our first project.
I'm going to scroll slowly so
Yeah,
that
that
people
one,
can see.
that one,
All right.
those two.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. So that one is Nadieh's visualization of all of the lines spoken in Lord of the Rings. I don't know why I'm describing your visualization. Is that are we gonna I describe yours and you describe mine?
Sure.
Great way to do it.
Which I actually really love. It is, what did you call it? It's kind of like a stretched out chord diagram. And in the middle, we have all of the main characters from Lord of the Rings. And then if you hover over them, you can see all of the chords that lead out to all of the different locations in Middle Earth that they had dialogue. And I remember one of the stories. Sorry, I'm not a huge Lord of the Rings fan. So if I get this wrong, I'm sorry. But I remember there was like your favorite fact is that Boromir, who dies in the first or second film, has more dialogue than Legolas in all three films.
Yes.
You can see that very clearly in this visualization.
Well, and this one, so I paused on this one in the book as I was looking through because I found it fascinating. And I'll jump in and describe your work now, Nadieh. But you start with the sketches, right, of what you thought it was going to look like, and then stepped back, and I'm totally paraphrasing here, but realized like, oh, at the core, this looks like a chord diagram. But then there were all sorts of crazy things you had to do to get the curves just right and like the math behind the scenes, right, to actually get it to render as it does, which is like sort of a chord diagram, but not your standard one, right?
Yeah, exactly. I had this idea for a sketch, but I placed things in the center of the chord diagram. And I knew there was no way, at least in D3, the JavaScript library D3, no way to basically do that. So I copied the code that D3 uses and started JavaScript writing and mutating it slowly into what I wanted it to become, which was a fascinating challenge.
And is that something that that process, is that something that you've done in other projects as well?
More and more. When I started out, I definitely didn't know enough to be able to even make those changes. And my first like big change that I made was merely basically a horizontal offset, and then that worked. And then I had the confidence to make the bigger step, and it's basically been going like that. And now I'm at a point where I'm feel much more comfortable going into any kind of sort of data viz code and making adjustments and trying out things, and it's been working more and more often just through the experience that I've gathered along the last few years.
And did you start off, did you have a background knowing how to program before this?
So through my astronomy background, I knew how to program in some arcane language that only astronomers use. But the sort of the mindset of for loops,
right?
Yeah, to think in arrays and these things. So as a data scientist, I worked a lot in R. I still do a lot in R. But for learning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, that started with me when I wanted to learn D3, which I think in 2016, I'd been working with D3 on and off for about 3 years at that point. So, but it was it was a struggle at the start, but it was just so amazing what you could do with that tool, make it interactive, make it different than your Excel charts in a way, which I really loved to be able to explore that creativity.
Nadieh, Ben wants to know what the astronomy language was.
IDL. Do you know it?
Shirley, do we want to look at film flowers too?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yes. It's actually one of my favorites from Shirley. She has so many beautiful ones. I love how she's always so out of the box. Uh, so with film flowers, Shirley has taken the top 5 or 6, I forgot, let's say 5 summer blockbuster movies for every year that she's been alive. And every aspect, so every movie is turned into a flower, and every aspect of how the flower looks is part of on data. So the petal shape is the H rating, PG or R rated. The colors are the different genres. Most movies are different genres. The number of IMDb votes is the number of petals, and the size is the actual IMDb rating. So you get this beautiful sort of grid of flowers that is just very sort of mesmerizing to look at. But if you look closely, you can see these trends and things going on, or just inspect your favorite movie, see how it looks.
But my favorite is like, a lot of these flowers are really big, right? Like there's Guardians of the Galaxy, there's, Gravity and Dark Knight Rises. All of them are really big, which means that they're really well rated. And then you go all the way down to 1997. And then look all the way to the left, and there's Batman and Robin,
Tiny.
which is so tiny you can't even see the colors. So that's personally my favorite flower. But I really loved your point about all of the iterations that Nadieh went through, and I was wondering if it's worth showing the write up for Nadieh for that particular project. It might be worth
for
showing.
the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. And so actually, and then, if you click on write up, and then this is the online version that everybody still has access to. And then if you get our book instead, there is the much more tightened up version with also kind of has all of the lessons and technical lessons in there too in the book. So
yeah, and we'll make sure that we link to all of these things that we're talking about in the show notes too, so people will have those for reference to take a look. Yeah, I love seeing the evolution though, right? From the drawings to the chord diagram to where it ends up. Here's a question that came in from Rebecca that I think is relevant here, which is whether you were each artistic as children, right? Did this, you've just always drawn and kept drawing, or did the drawing get rekindled at some point? How does sketching play into your work?
I could at least say a big yes on that account for both of us. I know also from Shirley, but we were both very sort of creative as kids. I love to draw. I was also I like to do other things such as or more origami based or just weird stuff with paint, doing things in ways I wasn't supposed to do. I did kind of drop out of the drawing after my 14th, so my sketching right now is very rough. But for data visualization, you really don't need to be an artist to create good sketches because it's usually just simple curves and circles and rectangles and things like that. So that's fine. But that creative side, that was always something that was part of me, and I only realized I was missing that from data science when I found that data visualization was my passion, and then finally I felt complete in that sort of being back on that creative side.
oh yeah, I really love that. And I love your point about how I think it helps to have a art or creative background, but you really don't need it to like sketch out your ideas. I love that point, Nadieh. And yeah, because like if you look at our sketches, it's just like really rough. It's just to get our like ideas in our heads down onto paper and then like flesh out those ideas. So you really don't need the art background. But I actually also do have a, I guess, relatively strong art background. I never went to like an art university or anything, but I remember one of my most most memorable first gifts that I got as like a 4-year-old was a watercolor set. I don't know whose idea it was to give a 4-year-old a watercolor set. And then I drew and painted all the way until I was 18, about to go into university. I took art classes all throughout high school. And I think that's what really helps these days. Of I don't have a formal design background or an art background, but it really taught me about color theory and about how to think about like perspective and layout. And I think that really helps in terms of like the UI UX design of like just even having been trained about like how to lay out your content such that you guide a viewer's eyes throughout the page. And then I remember I went to university and I quit cold turkey on anything art related because my mom denies this, but she told me that she would not pay my tuition if I took any art classes. She denies this now. But I will not let her live this down. So I was so like, I felt so deprived from the art that I, joined the graphic design club, and then still felt really deprived. And then when I got my first job as a front end developer at a big data company, I was offered to take a look at D3. And that was when I was like, oh, this makes so much sense to me because growing up, I loved both art and math. And there's such a strong math component to data visualization. And then I grew up to love code. So data viz to me is like a beautiful combination of all three things that I really love. And especially like I'm trying to do more like artistically, like creatively free. That I enjoy so much of like when I was a kid, I was like, I want to be an artist. And then I kind of gave up on that. And these days I'm like, oh, maybe I can be an artist, but instead of my medium being watercolor, it could be code and data.
I love that. I'm going to try to write it down, but I'm going to move on actually, so I don't write it down. We'll catch her back. That's an awesome snippet, but so many good questions coming in. By the way, I'll pull one from Maxine. This is, both of you come from science, math backgrounds. Do you think this facilitated learning D3? And she's asking whether trigonometry and such, that sort of knowledge is necessary for those wanting to learn it.
I think definitely in the sense with science, if you have that background, you are more used to working with math and formulas. And I do find that I often work with trigonometry if I want to lay out certain things in radial coordinates. It doesn't really get much more complex than that. You don't have to do any differential equations to do data visualization, but you do kind of need to know the sort of the spatial stuff. But thankfully, that's more of the easy math. I think it's more useful on the, at least for me, it's been very useful for the data side because I've been more trained in how to handle and analyze and be statistical about data. So that part of data visualization, that was nicer, that I kind of knew how to wrangle my data and then I could really focus on the design side. So I would say that the science background is really great for doing data visualization, but it doesn't mean that it's bad if you come in from the design side. I would just say that try and focus on, ramping up your data wrangling skills, at least so that you know how to handle data properly.
Yeah. And I think that because creating a whole data visualization requires so many different skills, like, at the most foundational, it requires some amount of, like Nadieh said, data wrangling. Then you need to be able to kind of like have some amount of information design skills. Then there's like, if you do want to make something custom for the web or anywhere custom, then you need some amount of coding. And then like probably most importantly, along with the design is like the storytelling. So then like, I think it's not a bad thing to, like when you get into it, you probably are coming from one of those aspects and you might not have all of them. And then it's like a slow, as you make more and more visualizations, you can kind of pick up on the rest. So definitely like if you come up from like a non-math and science background, it's just a matter of learning and picking up those skills. And just like Nadieh said, it's mostly trig and stats. And even in trig, it's kind of like, I think the two that I use the most are like converting from polar coordinates to Euclidean coordinates. So that's just some cosines and sines. lines. And then I think the distance formula. I think those are like the two things that I use. Then the distance formula you learn in like middle school. So except for sometimes I'll like peek at Nadieh's sketches and there's some like intense math going on and I have no idea what she's doing. I'm just like, is that an integral? Like what?
I love it. I'm going to jump back to a question that was raised when we were looking through some of the movie visuals from Julia, wanting to know more about the tool side of things. So Nadieh touched on this a little bit, but what tools do you find yourselves turning to create some of the projects that we're seeing?
Yeah, so for me, I think and I'm going to preface this by saying my background comes from the software engineering side, and that's how my tools are a little bit biased from that. And so for me personally, on the data side, I've never used R, so I don't use R, and instead I use JavaScript. I tried to get into Python, and the context switching between JavaScript and Python was so intense for me that I was like, I might as well. Like, it's faster for me to just do JavaScript. And so I like do all of my data collection and gathering, other than the manual entry ones, with JavaScript, usually with Node. And then I use for data cleaning, still JavaScript and Excel spreadsheets. When I go into data exploration, I use observable notebooks to kind of help me kind of like organize my exploration, as well as a JavaScript-based charting library called Vega Lite. And that one kind of helps me just really quickly put the data into some simple charts for me to get an idea, just because my stats is kind of weak. So I tend to explore the data better visually. And then finally, I usually sketch with my iPad in a program called Paper 53. And I finish with code with both D3 and other JavaScript libraries. Usually, recently, last few years, I've really enjoyed a JavaScript library called Vue that helps me manage kind of like state and data changes, and Greenstock for animation. So that's kind of like my typical set of tools. And I do want to say that in our book, we have a whole section where we go into great detail about the tech and tools that we use.
Nadieh, anything to add there?
So yeah, I use a different slice of tools, but by the way, our book is very tool agnostic in that sense. It's more about conveying the mindset of how we start from scratch and go through it. So there's barely any line of any kind of code in there, only in a few technical lessons, but that's why we set them apart. But yeah, so I always do data prep and data analysis in R. I like to there get a sense and sort of build up my own mental model of what's in the data set, what are the stories, what are the distributions. I make hundreds of very basic and ugly plots, the bar charts, the histograms. I don't mean they're ugly charts, I mean they look like they're just default stuff. Then once I have sort of this idea of like, okay, this is what I want to tell, I again in R reconstruct my data set to what I will need to make it visual. Then I jump over to D3 as well, like Shirley. But for me, it's very vanilla. I hardly ever put anything else inside that. So it's really just HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and D3. I build it up there, lots of testing, and then even if it's a static thing, I might actually take it back into Illustrator or Affinity Designer to really make those final fine tunings that are quite hard to program, such as legends, and then do it over there and then finish the piece off. But if it's on the web, and then sort of that second part is where it stays.
And let me add in a quick aside of I always wondered how Nadieh got such beautiful legends for all of her projects, because legends are so much work to code in like D3 with SVG or Canvas. And I've always been so bad with legends because I'm so lazy at doing that. And then I read her write-ups and she was like, I use Illustrator. And I was like, using the best tools for the job. What a mind-blowing concept.
Isn't it lovely though when you get those sort of eureka moments of why didn't I think of that sooner, right?
Definitely.
So I have a question that's a much longer conversation. We don't need to go to full depth, but I think it was Lisa brought up something here as well. But how do you think about color in your designs?
Ooh. Nadieh has a great answer, I feel like. Much better than mine.
I was actually waiting for yours.
Oh.
No, for color, So usually when I start out with the project, I turn everything rainbow because that's just more fun to look at than everything's black or gray. But then I start thinking about the topic, for example. What feeling do I get with the topic for astronomy-based topics? I'll probably start with a more dark theme
Do you
that's kind of
seriously
more.
start with rainbow colors?
Oh yeah. I start with rainbow colors.
I love it.
Everything's just every.
That was my mind getting blown.
It's just more fun. I mean, I don't always keep it that way. Sometimes in the right moments when it's, but usually I switch to something else. So for astronomy, darker blues, lighter blues, and the purples and the pinks. Whereas for the music project that's in the data sketches book that I created is very much black and white to mimic that vinyl records, and then I made some of the circles look like tiny vinyl records.
So
And
really
it's
thinking
so I,
about the theme and the topic and choosing a color palette that's going to match that.
yeah, to really make that metaphor more easy for people to understand the topic that it's about, and also sort of fitting it. But I also keep in mind sort of the design that I have created. So how many colors am I going to need? A lot or only a few? And in what ways are colors going to be in there? But that's really more of a case by case basis. And although I do have sort of color theory in the back of my mind and trying to find good color combos, so um, if I'm having difficulties, I will just create blocks in Affinity Designer and put them in the colors that I in the background color that I have in mind, and then I start fine tuning things. And
Okay.
for example, if I'm using one color a lot, I make that block very big, and then I
Ooh.
start then again
Just to
dragging
be
the
able to
colors until I
see
feel.
them together.
Yes, to be able to see them together, and then at some point I will, apply them to my visualization, and that's kind of an iterative process. And sometimes I can go a completely different direction, just to
And
try something else.
do you have any tips? And so Yug just commented, colors are so tricky because you almost need to have some artistic sensibility when it comes to choosing those. And the comment is that most data viz workers have engineer with no art sort of life paths. So for someone who would look at themselves that way, do you have any really practical tips when it comes to color selection or resources?
Mine is find a piece that you love, that you think is sort of fits the visualization in some way, and pick the colors from there. That's how I started.
Ooh, yeah, I have so many thoughts on this because actually, like, color is one of my biggest weaknesses. Of like, like in theory, I understand, but like, in practice, I think it's so hard. And so over the years, I've learned quite a few things. Which I also want to say that Nadi's starting with rainbow, I think is actually a really good idea because so well, it depends on I think uh, one of the things I first think about when I'm thinking about color is like the purpose of that color. Like, is it because I'm trying to visualize something that's categorical and thus I need like, very distinct hues? Or is it something that's more like quantitative and continuous? And so I just need like maybe one or two set of colors. And especially I think the hardest, like, because if you need something continuous, that's almost an easier job because you choose one or two colors and you adjust its like either vibrance or its luminosity. Is that the same thing? Hold on, saturation or luminosity, and then you kind of go from there. Whereas like I think categorical color palettes are so hard because you need like distinct enough hues, and that's why I say that like Nadi starting from rainbow I think is such a good idea actually, because then you naturally get a like very distinct set of hues. And actually I think one of the most beautiful things about Nadi's color palettes is that like she has like a very her own distinct style of a color palette where it's certainly the rainbow, but then it's like also much more vibrant. Like I don't know like what you do with the saturation or like but like it's the color palette is very vibrant. So when I first started freelancing like 4 years ago, I knew that I was really weak in my colors. So I think I was actually kind of inspired by Nadi's color palette, and I went and used this JavaScript library called Chroma. And I'm sure that other tools have something similar, but Chroma is this like library for working with color. And one of the most like helpful functions for me is this function called dot scale, or just chroma dot scale. And what it does is you can put in any number of colors into that function, and it will interpolate between each of those colors and give you a color scale. And so what I did was, I think when I first started, I chose maybe like, the 7 colors of the rainbow and put it at a saturation and brightness I really liked, plugged it into chroma.scale. And then I think I had it generate like 36 or 48 distinct colors that were like all, between each of those like rainbows. And ever since, for the last 4.5 years, I've just been like picking out colors from that palette and then plugging it sometimes into chroma to like adjust, some amount of usually I just adjust the saturation, or I might pick like, 2 colors and then I might then plug it into the scale again. And another thing about the scale is you can tell it how to interpolate between the 2 colors. So then if you tell it to interpolate like HSV versus like some other thing, it will interpolate it differently. So that's like the practical way of how I generate my color palettes. And because I start from that kind of basic same color palette every single time, that's how I have like a pretty uniform color palette for every single one of my projects, and that kind of like distinct style. That was very long. So one last practical advice is I always, after I choose a color palette that I quite like, I'll plug it into a tool from Susie Liu and Elijah Meeks called Viz Palette, because that one, they built it such that you can like kind of paste in a set of color strings, and then it will tell you if there's enough contrast between each of the colors for accessibility reasons. And they'll also give you the option to toggle between different color deficiencies and tell you if there's also good contrast for accessibility there too. That was my very long rant about color.
And I just have to jump in because I just saw Catherine had posted, this is fascinating. I love how Cole was shocked at the rainbow as a starting point. To me, it speaks to audience and how biased business audiences are to typical blue, grays, oranges. She says, when I was doing data viz as a management consultant, I would try to sneak pink or purple into my vizzes, and it made people so uncomfortable. Which is such an interesting point, right? That we can use color to shock or to get people's attention when we use it in a different way than they expect as well. Let's talk about one thing we haven't touched on yet. We talk about the project, we talk about the book, but how did the project become a book? And I'm also curious as part of that, which is a whole discussion probably in and of itself. And I think Jennifer asked a question about this as well, but how do you take something that was definitely intended and created for online interactivity and print it in a book?
So, yes, it was part of it in a way, because the write-ups were already sort of the static thing where it was mostly screenshots, and there were a few sort of videos in there that kind of show the progress. And for the bookification,
Bookification, I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, that's what we've been using. We kind of made sort of this tiny, like a few scenes from that animation that might be happening, and paste the images side by side. And we have this sort of final screenshot section that is at the end of every write-up, where we show big splash images of different modes of the visualization if it was interactive. Not all of them are as highly interactive as others, but we kind of give you the sense of how the project sort of looks. And of course, we put the link in the book where you can really experience the full visualization as it's intended. And in terms of how it turned into a book, well, that was again more surely than me. There was a video cast, I don't know how to call, by Alberto Caro and Simon Rogers, and Alberto was talking about data sketches, and this was just when it was sort of when we came out with it. It's like, hey, we have data sketches, and he said, well, I would love to see, would have to have a coffee table book of this project on my table at some point. And then Shirley just grabbed onto that. It's like, a book, we need to make a book.
How many projects had you completed together? How many months into it were you at this
2
point?
months. That's 2 months. 2 months. There were only 4 projects.
Yeah. So, Shirley managed to talk me into that idea, and then we started looking for publishers. At that time in 2016, it was actually very hard for us to find a publisher that would take on this idea of, like, we have this big fancy coffee table book, big images, colorful, but also technical. So it's also meant to really teach you something.
Do you think so? Once you hit the point of knowing you were going to do a book or anticipating that, did that change how you chose your projects or anything that you did along the course of the way? Do you think? No,
Not at all. Not.
Shirley's shaking her
No.
head. No. Okay. All right. So you're 4 months in, you've done, or 2 to 4 months in, you've done these projects, you decide to make a book. Now you're shopping for publishers.
So I think actually we were about 4 months in, and it was like Nadi said, it was really hard. No publisher wanted to do a combination of both. I wanted like either or. And it wasn't until I was in Vancouver for some reason. I don't actually remember why I was in Vancouver, but I met up with Tamara Munzner because she's based in Vancouver, and we just had this casual dinner together.
And was she at that point a professor at its University of British Columbia?
Yeah, I think she's been there maybe, I guess 10, 15 years. And she wrote a textbook called Visual Analysis and Design. I always get confused about the order of the words.
Yes, I can see it on my bookshelf. Visual Analysis and Design.
Thank you. And so we had dinner together, and unbeknownst to me, apparently she was getting ready to pitch to me that Data Sketches should be a book. And so she thought that she had like this uphill battle to convince me. And then as soon as she said it, I was like, yes, we've been trying to do this for months and nobody wants to do what we want to do. And she's like,
what perfect timing, huh?
Yeah. And she was like kind of the perfect editor to champion our book or champion the project, because she had like such deep knowledge about the project. She really liked it. She shared it with her grad students in her classes. And I think the reason why she was so great was because she loved the write-ups, the technical aspect of the write-ups just as much as we did. And so she was the one that was like, we need to maintain this in the book. And also the book is important because she has been around the web for like, a long time. So she understands the concept of a project bit rotting. I love that term. And no longer working on the web. So she's like, you need to archive not only the visual side of this, but also the technical write-ups. And that's how we found kind of the perfect person to champion our book, as well as a publisher that was willing to go with the vision that we had.
Because it's such an interesting combination, right? Because on the one hand, you do have the coffee table aspect of it's this ginormous book and it's beautiful, right? You can tell that here Nadi's holding it up. The printing is beautiful. The colors are amazing. And so, and the full page bleed on everything. It's beautiful as you look through it. But then it's also got this deep process technical, and you mentioned like there's not that much code. I know as I flipped through, it seemed like a lot of code, but like it's balanced so nicely with the art side of it as well. Who did you write it for? Who is your ideal person who comes across it and adds it to their library and devours it?
Ooh, great question. So I think we both love having kind of like layers in our work. So with our visualizations, um, and just like in our visualizations for our book, what we wanted to do was have it be accessible to a really wide audience, where we hoped that, for it can attract people that aren't familiar with data visualizations with those big beautiful images and its color and its full page. And so it would entice them to flip through. And then we were hoping that it can, like attract beginners into data visualization with the book, because then we go into a lot of detail about our thought process and like all of the steps in creating a full visualization. And we also try to give like tips and tricks and lessons that we learned. And then finally, we're hoping that it could also entice like intermediate to like advanced creators also, because again, we go into a lot of detail about like advanced, I don't know the word,
well, I was scrolling through, and there was like at one point I think it was a 2-page spread on the trig that you used for one of your projects. I think it was the travel one.
Yeah, and SVG versus Canvas, custom animations, just all of the concepts behind it. So even if you have like the basics of D3 or basics of DataViz down, hopefully all of those kind of like more technical know-hows that we share would like take your practice to the next level.
So there have been a few questions that have come up on related but slightly different bent and topic, which is on your roles as freelancers. I think both from the standpoint of, when you first started doing this as a side project, how did you find time for it? How do you decide when to make that jump to freelancer? What sort of challenges do you face there? Because I think for a lot of people who do data visualization as part of their work in a business setting, the idea of a data visualization freelance career can seem like this super shiny, beautiful thing. But I know there are challenges that go along with that as well. Can you just talk a little bit about your freelance experiences, which I know we don't have a ton of time left, but I want to make sure we at least touch on this.
Yeah, of course. So when we started Data Sketches, like I mentioned, I was doing dashboards with D3, but I was kind of noticing that it wasn't quite fulfilling that creative side in me. So it was therefore kind of sort of an outlet for me to be able to work on Data Sketches in my evenings and in a weekend. I don't know how I've completely sort of passed that phase where I'm able to do that, but at that point I was so full of this sort of passion that I managed to do that. And when we had done 2 months of data sketches, it was so clear to me that this was the type of data visualization that I love the most. Like I love data viz, but this was even better. So I was thinking about, well, this freelancing would be interesting to see if there's a market for more of this more creative side of data viz, maybe this sort of uniquely made around one specific data set kind of data viz. And then I think it was somewhere around October, and Alberto Cairo reached out to us, and he was an art director then to help create pieces for Google News Lab. And he asked us, do you maybe want to do one project of data sketches together as a collaboration with Google News Lab, and then we'll pay you for it. And then I felt like, I don't want to say no to Google News Lab. And the only way that I could really take that on.
You two have had different series of stars aligning, right? Where you recognize you want to do something or the need for something, and then the right person is, you've manifested your destiny, right?
Exactly. So I figured out the financial side. I'm very financially I was always very insecure, the idea of not getting a paycheck. I figured out I could last for 6 months and then talk with my partners, like, we're going to do this. And so I started in January, and by July, thankfully things had turned out well and I could actually pull this off. And it's been like the best decision I've ever made, even though it was a very frightening one.
Yeah, similarly, I had started data sketches right after I had I had started freelancing. And so I think the first 6 or 7 months were really rough because I kind of went into it with the plan that if I could make it work in a year, then I would keep going. But if I couldn't, then I'll go back to a full-time job. And so I had enough financial runway there, but it was still very financially stressful. And so I think the first 6 or 7 months, it was not healthy because I was working around the clock. Like literally the only breaks that I was taking, it was like 30-minute lunches and dinners for like 6 or 7 months. Do not recommend. But it was, I think that amount of work was, I think, what was necessary to really, for me to have gotten to where I am now. And I think there's some things that were very intentional on both of our parts of the fact, for example, that data sketches were public facing. I think that, even by the time Alberta reached out, I think we had 3 or 4 published data sketches projects that were in our portfolio. And I was also very intentional with the first client projects I took, that they were all public facing. And I turned down some that were going to pay me really well to do internal work. Yeah.
And can you talk about why, so the external facing, the public stuff, so that you'd have evidence of your work that you could share with others? Was that the thought?
Yeah. So I think so I actually also studied business in university, and I think it was that business background that kind of helped me have the intuition that I needed to like set up essentially a brand for myself to be able to and back in 2016, one of the things I learned was that it was still such a niche market that I cannot reach out that if I cold call someone, they wouldn't have the budget for data visualization like that they might have for like design. And so the strategy had to be that I needed to put out as much of my work out there, establish my brand so that people would reach out to me instead because they liked my style or they liked my work. And even then, I think the first 6 months or so were really rough. And it wasn't until, like Nadieh said, Alberto reached out to us for Google News Labs. And that almost changed my freelancing like overnight, because before that project, people would hear my rate and they'd be like, that's a little bit high. And then after I published the Google News Labs, people would be like, okay. And I had even raised my rate $50 per hour. And so it was like, nothing about me or my skills have changed, but that big name
No, but the
really
credibility you
added
got with, yeah.
yeah. And that's, I think by then, I think that's what really solidified the freelancing for me personally.
So there is so much more we could talk about. And I know we haven't hit every question that came in, but we're almost up on the hour, which has flown by. This has been hugely fun. But before we wrap, where do you look for inspiration? Because I'm curious, right? Because I imagine you have ideas that strike you clearly, but I have to imagine you look places intentionally to spark that creativity at times. Or correct me if that's not the case, but curious if there's anything from your process of project conceptualization or just where you look for creativity that may help inspire some of the rest of us too.
I think that the idea that inspiration will sort of spark you out of nothing is, for me, totally not true. I really have to look at things and be inspired by what I see at that time and really take the time and sit down to be inspired. To do this, I have Pinterest boards. So everything I see online that interests me in any way, any kind of visual way, either data viz or other topics that I find interesting, such as space-related things or historic sky maps, whatever. And when I start on a new project, I will kind of go through some of these boards and create a secret client mood board for everything that kind of seems to stick, even though I'm not quite sure yet. And I gather it all up. And then when I start designing and thinking about things, I have this on my screen. So I'm inspired a lot by what comes online, what comes by online, and what has just been recently, what I've been seeing in the world around me.
And for me, I think from a project conception, like topics, I think I've always been a very curious child, and that has like gone into adulthood. And so for me, a lot of the topic inspirations are just from my day-to-day life, observing like things around me, being like, I wonder why it's that way. And then that's what would spark a inspiration or spark a particular interest in a topic. And then I'll go out and find the data set for it. And from a visual inspiration perspective, I think it's very similar to Nadieh in that I just try to keep an eye out a lot for things that I find beautiful. But I do try not to look at other people's data visualizations too much, because I think to have my own distinct style, I can't, like, I get too easily influenced by others. And so I take a lot of inspiration from nature, from like going to like art museums and other fields that are like tangentially related, but not data visualization. And then once in a while, I'll peek back at other people's data viz to be like, oh, that's a really interesting technique, or to like kind of catalog, but not all the time.
Great tips and ideas. I love it. So as we move to close, I'll just mention that folks who are interested in learning more about Shirley and Nadieh and the new book, you can check out their book website, which is at datasketch.es, which is a brilliant URL. You can find more out about Nadieh and her work at visualcinnamon.com, and Shirley is at shirleywu.studio. Ladies, do you have any final thoughts to share with us today?
I actually want to share that even though we're in a pandemic right now, we did manage to create signed copies, a limited amount of signed copies. And there is a special form that you need to sign into, and we have a 20% discount code, and we'll be tweeting that out on the @DataSketches Twitter really soon. So if you want a copy, I definitely recommend to get one through there.
Yeah. And then please follow us on Twitter. And we also have a newsletter for Data Sketches where we'll keep you updated on all of the book related media, PR things, interviews that
But not
we
too
have
often.
going on. No, newsletters are like once every month or so, but Twitter will keep you up to date with everything that's going on, including this podcast.
Fantastic. So Shirley, Nadieh, it has been an absolute pleasure to chat with you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
again for
much.
having us.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so
yeah.
fun.
And congratulations again. And I'll just say, as a final reminder to those watching and listening, be sure to check out their new book, Data Sketches. And thanks very much for tuning in.